What if the very thing you fear slipping away, time, was never meant to be held at all? Discover the story of a broken hourglass and a wisdom so profound it will change the way you see every moment of your life. The sun hung low in the Galilean sky, painting the hills in warm hues of gold and orange. A gentle breeze rustled through the ancient olive tree, its gnarled branches casting dappled shadows on the soft earth below. One by one the disciples arrived, their faces etched with a mixture of curiosity and concern. The air was heavy with the weight of unspoken thoughts, and though they exchanged greetings, the atmosphere was subdued. Each of them carried a private burden, questions about their journey, worries about the trials ahead, and doubts that whispered in the quiet moments of their days. Peter, restless as ever, sat on a smooth rock, absently tossing a small pebble between his hands. He stared into the distance, his thoughts a storm of conflicting emotions. John leaned against the sturdy trunk of the olive tree, his arms folded, his mind swimming with questions he dared not voice. Mary Magdalene knelt nearby, her hands brushing through the tall grass as she gazed at the horizon. Her eyes, filled with a quiet determination, betrayed the remnants of a sorrow she was still learning to let go of. Thomas, seated cross-legged on the ground, shifted uncomfortably. His doubt was like a persistent thorn, pricking his conscience no matter how much he tried to ignore it. Breaking the silence, Thomas asked, "Do you think he knows what weighs on our hearts?" His voice carried a note of skepticism, though his eyes darted nervously to the others, seeking reassurance. Mary, ever perceptive, turned to him. "He always knows," she said softly, her voice steady but kind. "He sees more than what we show, even the things we try to hide from ourselves." The conversation lulled as they turned their gazes up the hill. There, silhouetted against the fading sunlight, was Jesus. He walked with a calm and deliberate grace, his robe catching the evening breeze. The disciples felt their unease begin to soften as he approached. His very presence carried a peace that seemed to settle over the hills, over the land, and over their troubled hearts. When he reached them, he sat down among them, folding his hands in his lap. His eyes swept over the group, each gaze meeting his own, as though he could see directly into their souls. "My friends," Jesus said, his voice gentle yet firm, "tell me what troubles your hearts today?" At first no one spoke. The disciples exchanged glances, unsure of who should begin. Finally Peter, ever the boldest, broke the silence. His voice was uncharacteristically uncertain, his words tumbling out as if he had been holding them back for too long. "Lord," he said, his brow furrowed, "I feel as though time is slipping away from me. Every day feels shorter than the last, and I fear that I will fail you before my time is done." His confession hung in the air, heavy and raw. The others nodded, their own burdens resonating with Peter's words. Thomas spoke next, his tone edged with frustration. "I feel stuck, Lord. Time moves but I remain the same. I am not enough. No matter how hard I try, I cannot shake this feeling of doubt that clings to me." Mary Magdalene, always thoughtful, added her voice. "I carry my past with me even now. I try to walk in your light, but there are days when the shadows feel too close. The memories of what I was, they remind me how much time I wasted before finding you." Jesus listened carefully, his expression one of deep compassion. He leaned forward, clasping his hands together as if drawing their burdens closer to himself. He could feel the weight of their fears, the relentless ticking of the clock in their minds, the pressure to do and be more, the ache of regret for time lost and the anxiety for time yet to come. "Let me tell you a story," Jesus said at last. His voice carried a warmth that invited them to lean in, their curiosity piqued despite their worries. "It is the story of a craftsman and a broken hourglass. Perhaps, in hearing it, you will understand what I have to share with you today." Jesus began his story with vivid detail, painting a picture of a humble craftsman who lived in a small, bustling village. The man's workshop was tucked away at the end of a cobblestone street, its walls lined with shelves of gleaming hourglasses. Each piece was unique, its glass polished to perfection, its frame adorned with intricate carvings. The craftsman was known far and wide for his unparalleled skill, and his hourglasses were said to be more than mere timepieces. They were symbols of life itself. People came from distant lands to purchase his creations, believing they held a secret magic. They admired how the sand flowed so perfectly, measuring time with unerring precision. Some said the hourglasses could teach them how to live wisely, to cherish each fleeting moment. The craftsman, a quiet and thoughtful man, never spoke of magic or miracles. He simply did his work with care, pouring his heart into each creation. One day a traveler arrived, weary and burdened. His clothes were dusty from the road, and in his hands he clutched the remains of a shattered hourglass. His face was lined with worry, his eyes hollow from sleepless nights. The traveler approached the craftsman, holding out the broken pieces as though they were a part of his own soul. "Master," the traveler said, his voice trembling, "this hourglass was given to me by my father. It has been my guide, my reminder to value time. But now it is broken and I feel as though I am lost without it." The craftsman took the broken hourglass and examined it carefully. The glass was cracked, its frame splintered, and the sand spilled freely through his fingers. The traveler's hands shook as he watched the grains fall, his desperation palpable. "Please," he begged, "fix it. I cannot bear to see my time slipping away like this." The disciples listened intently, their imaginations filling with the image of the craftsman's workshop and the despair of the traveler. Jesus paused, letting the tension build before continuing. "The craftsman," he said, "did something unexpected." The traveler's hands trembled as the craftsman gently poured the remaining sand onto the ground. The grains caught the sunlight, sparkling like gold dust as they scattered in the breeze. The traveler gasped, his voice rising in panic. "What are you doing?" he cried. "You're wasting it. That sand is all I have left." The craftsman looked at him with eyes full of understanding, his voice calm and steady. "Time is not yours to hold," he said. "It is not something to hoard or measure. Time is a gift, meant to be lived, not controlled." The traveler stared at him, his confusion turning to frustration. "But without the hourglass, how will I know how much time I have? How will I know what to do or how to spend my days?" The craftsman smiled, his hands still cupping the broken glass. "Do you see how the sand flows freely now? It is not bound by the glass nor by your fears. Time is not your master, it is your companion. Live your days not in fear of their end, but in the fullness of their presence." For the first time, the traveler began to see the wisdom in the craftsman's words. Tears filled his eyes as he realized how much of his life had been spent worrying about the passage of time, rather than embracing the moments it brought. The traveler stood in stunned silence, watching as the grains of sand sparkled and danced in the wind. Each grain seemed to carry with it a memory, a moment of his life that he had tried so desperately to control. Now they were slipping away, scattered beyond his reach. A deep pang of grief rose in his chest, but beneath it, something else stirred, a strange, unfamiliar lightness. The craftsman placed a hand on the traveler's shoulder, steadying him. "You see," he said gently, "when the hourglass is broken, time is no longer something to measure. It becomes free like the sand in the wind. You cannot trap it, nor should you. Instead, let it remind you that life is not meant to be lived in fear of its end, but in the fullness of its moments." The traveler looked down at the fragments of the hourglass in the craftsman's hands. "But how do I let go?" he whispered. "How do I live without counting the time I have left? Feels terrifying." The craftsman's eyes softened, and he knelt to pick up a single grain of sand from the ground. Holding it between his fingers, he said, "This grain is this moment, this breath, this heartbeat, this thought. It is not part of the past, nor is it yet the future. It is yours here and now. What will you do with it?" The question lingered in the traveler's mind, echoing with a clarity that pierced through his fear. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to take a deep breath and truly feel the moment. The sun warming his face, the breeze rustling the trees, the craftsman's steady presence beside him. It was all real, all alive. He began to weep, not from sadness but from a newfound understanding. As Jesus finished this part of the story, he glanced around the circle of his disciples. Their faces were filled with wonder, each one processing the lesson in their own way. Peter broke the silence, his voice hesitant but filled with curiosity. "Lord, what does it mean for us? Are we like the traveler, afraid of the sand slipping through our fingers?" Jesus smiled, his eyes shining with patience. "Yes, Peter. Many of you hold on too tightly to time, as though it is something you can control. But in doing so, you lose sight of what truly matters. Time is not your master, it is a gift, a companion on your journey. Do not live in fear of its passing." Thomas furrowed his brow, still grappling with the lesson. "But how can we live without worrying about the future?" he asked. "How can we walk this path when we do not know what lies ahead?" Jesus turned to Thomas, placing a reassuring hand on his arm. "You do not need to know the future to live fully in the present. Trust in the Father, for He holds your days. Do not let the fear of the unknown steal the joy of the now." Mary Magdalene, her voice thoughtful, added, "But what about the past, Lord? Sometimes it feels as though the weight of what we've done keeps us from living freely." Jesus nodded, his expression solemn. "The past is like sand that has already fallen. It cannot be returned to the hourglass. But it does not need to be. Instead, let it become part of the foundation upon which you build your life. Redemption is not found in erasing the past, but in transforming it." His words settled over them like a balm, soothing the deepest parts of their hearts. Each disciple felt a spark of hope, a glimpse of what it might mean to live beyond the constraints of fear and worry. In the days that followed, the disciples found themselves reflecting deeply on Jesus' story. They began to notice subtle changes in their own hearts and in one another. Peter, who had always been quick to act and often quicker to regret, started to approach his decisions with a newfound sense of peace. He no longer rushed to prove himself, trusting instead in the path he was walking. Thomas, though still prone to doubt, began to ask his questions with an openness that surprised even himself. Rather than seeking answers out of fear, he sought them out of a genuine desire to understand. Mary Magdalene, who had carried the weight of her past for so long, began to see it in a new light, not as a chain holding her back, but as a testament to the grace that had transformed her. The parable of the broken hourglass became a touchstone for them all. Whenever they felt the pull of worry or regret, they reminded themselves of the traveler and the craftsman. They began to see their days not as something to control, but as a series of moments to embrace. Their newfound understanding was soon tested when news arrived of growing opposition to their mission. Whispers of danger reached them, and the disciples were forced to confront the reality of what lay ahead. Fear crept into their hearts once more, threatening to unravel the peace they had found. One evening, as they gathered to discuss their next steps, Peter spoke up. His voice was steady, but his words carried the weight of his concern. "Lord, how can we face what is coming? The dangers are real, and the time we have feels so short." Jesus looked around the group, his gaze lingering on each face. "Remember the hourglass," he said. "Do not let fear bind you. Live each moment with love and purpose, and trust that the Father is with you, even in the midst of uncertainty." The disciples nodded, their resolve hardening. Though the path ahead was fraught with challenges, they carried with them the lessons of the broken hourglass. They chose to walk forward not in fear but in faith. As the disciples rested under the olive tree one last time, Jesus spoke with a quiet intensity that drew them close. The stars above them twinkled like grains of sand, a reminder of the infinite beauty of creation. "My beloved friends," he said, his voice full of tenderness, "the hourglass is always broken. Time is not yours to keep but to cherish. Love freely, serve joyfully, and live with faith. For in the kingdom of heaven, there is no measure of time, only the eternal presence of the Father's love." Tears welled in their eyes, not from sorrow, but from the overwhelming sense of hope his words brought. They felt as though a burden had been lifted, replaced by a lightness that came from knowing they were held in the hands of a loving Creator. Years later, after Jesus had ascended, the disciples often found themselves retelling the story of the broken hourglass. It became a cornerstone of their teaching, a parable they shared with anyone who would listen. They spoke of the craftsman and the traveler, of the sand that flowed freely and the liberation it brought. Each of them lived the lesson in their own way. Peter led with courage and humility, embracing each moment as an opportunity to love and serve. Thomas, though still seeking answers, found peace in the journey itself. Mary Magdalene, whose story had been one of redemption, became a beacon of hope for others, showing them how to live freely in the light of grace. The broken hourglass became more than a story, it became a way of life. It reminded them and all who heard it that time, like love, is most powerful when it flows freely. In living beyond the constraints of fear and worry, they discovered a freedom that carried them through all the trials and triumphs of their days. This is end of the story. Comment Amen if you believe in Jesus' blessings. Please like this video and subscribe this channel for more Jesus story like this. May the God watch over you.